The
Look,
Dog Who
over there.
Found the Way Back, Part 1. The
See the
Man and the
clearing?
Dog. The
Yes,
morning Declan
understood.
Merritt's dog
Good
saved a
boy.
stranger's life began like every other morning that winter, cold gray and quiet, in the way that only grief makes quiet. He stood on the back porch of the cabin, with a mug of coffee going cold in his hands, watching the tree line at the edge of the property, where the Blue Ridge Mountains rose up into low cloud. The forest was still, the kind of still that felt like the world was holding its breath. 2 years of mornings like this, and he still hadn't gotten used to it. He wasn't sure he wanted to. Rex sat beside him, close enough that his shoulder pressed against Declan's leg. The dog did that often, now positioned himself like a warm wall between Declan and whatever was coming. He was a big German shepherd, nearly 11 years old, with a broad chest and a face that had gone silver around the muzzle. His ears were slightly uneven. The right one carried a small scar along the outer edge, a thin, pale line in the dark fur that Declan had noticed the first day they gave Rex to him and never thought about again. Inside the cabin, Wren was still asleep, 8 years old, and she slept like she was making up for something deeply, completely, her small fist tucked under her chin. Declan had checked on her twice already. Old habit, new fear. The fears changed shape when you became a single parent. They became more specific, more physical, more present in the dark hours of the morning, when there was nothing to do but stand on a porch and think about all the ways the world could take what remained. He drank the cold coffee and let himself stand in the silence for a little while longer. There was a version of Declan Merritt that people in town remembered. The version that had come back from 15 years in the Navy with a chest full of decorations and a handshake that meant something. The version that had married Nora Calloway in the little stone church off Route 221 on a Saturday afternoon in October, the leaves coming down around them like the mountains were throwing a party. The version that had held Wren in the delivery room and felt something crack open inside his chest, that he had no tactical training for whatsoever, some chamber he hadn't known was there, flooding with a kind of love that had no tactical application and required no skill he possessed, and arrived anyway, complete and absolute and terrifying in its completeness. That version of Declan Merritt felt like someone he had read about, someone else's story. The man standing on the porch with the cold coffee was what remained after the accident on the highway 2 years ago, on a Wednesday evening in November, when Nora's car met a patch of black ice on the curve above the river, and everything that mattered went with it into the guardrail. Declan had been in the kitchen when his phone rang. He remembered the exact sound the spatula made when it hit the floor. He remembered Rex lifting his head from the rug by the fireplace, ears forward, already knowing something was wrong before Declan's face had time to understand the words coming through the phone. He put the mug down on the railing. Rex stood up, not the casual stretching stand of a dog deciding to move. Something else. The dog's body went from relaxed to focused in the space of a single breath. His ears snapped forward. His nose lifted, working the cold air with the deliberate precision of something that knows exactly what it is looking for. He turned toward the tree line at the north end of the property, not the trail they used every morning, but the far edge where the terrain pitched upward into rough country that Declan had never bothered to explore. Rex looked back at Declan once. Then he walked off the porch and started moving toward the trees. Declan watched him go. Rex. The dog didn't stop. Rex, come. Rex paused at the edge of the grass, turned his head back with an expression that Declan could only describe in the privacy of his own mind as deliberate, not uncertain, not distracted, deliberate, the expression of a creature that has made a calculation and arrived at a conclusion and is now waiting for the slower party to catch up. Then he continued into the trees. Declan stood on the porch for another few seconds. He thought about Wren asleep inside. He thought about the slope behind the property, which was steep and rocky and covered in a thin layer of ice from the night's freeze. He thought about the fact that he was 48 minutes from the nearest urgent care, and that Rex had never in 3 years of morning hikes deviated from their established trail by more than 20 feet. He went inside, checked on Wren, still deeply asleep, her fists tucked under her chin, her breathing even and slow, and left a note on the kitchen table in case she woke up. Then he pulled on his jacket, laced his boots, and followed his dog into the mountains. The trees closed around him within minutes, and the world went very quiet. The trail Rex was making wasn't a trail at all. It was a line through the forest that followed some logic Declan couldn't read around the base of a granite outcropping through a shallow draw where a frozen creek lay hidden under snow up a slope that forced Declan to use his hands on the rock faces to keep his footing. Rex moved ahead with a certainty that Declan recognized from somewhere deep in his training. The dog wasn't searching. He wasn't ranging back and forth the way he did when he was following a scent that kept doubling back. He was moving with direction, with intention. He knew where he was going. The cold was serious up here. Declan's breath came in short white bursts. His fingers, even inside his gloves, ached with it. The sky above the tree canopy was the color of old pewter flat and low, and without depth, and somewhere to the northwest, darker clouds were building against the ridge in the way that meant weather before the day was out. They climbed for 40 minutes. Declan's knee, the one that had taken a piece of shrapnel in the Kunar province in 2009, and never entirely forgiven him for it was making its feelings known by the time they reached the first real ledge. He stopped there, one hand braced against a pine trunk, and looked up at where Rex had paused on the rocks above him. The dog looked down at him with those steady amber eyes, waiting. Not impatient. Rex was never impatient, but present in a way that communicated clearly that there was somewhere to be, and the timeline mattered. "I'm coming," Declan said. "Give me a second." He gave himself 10, then he climbed. The flashback hit without warning, the way they always did, not like a memory, but like a reassignment of reality, sudden and total. One moment he was reaching for a handhold on cold granite. The next moment his hands were on a different kind of wall, rough concrete in the dark, and the sound of the mountain wind became the sound of a helicopter, and the smell of pine became the smell of diesel and dust and something burning at a temperature that had no civilian equivalent. His pulse went from steady to hammering in the time it took to blink. He knew the shape of it. 15 years of service had given him a map of his own nervous system, whether he wanted one or not. He pressed his back against the rock face. He breathed. He found three things to see: the pale lichen on the stone beside his boot, spreading across the granite in slow gray-green patterns that had taken decades to form and would take decades more; the dark shape of Rex above him on the ledge, the thin, hard line of sky between the trees. He found two things: to hear his own breathing, deliberate and counted, and the wind moving through the upper canopy, indifferent and continuous and real. He found one thing: to feel the cold of the rock through his glove, solid and present and entirely of this moment and no other. Rex was back beside him before the breathing had fully steadied. The dog came down the ledge without drama and pressed his full weight against Declan's legs, 102 pounds of warm, grounded presence standing against him, with the patience of something that has done this before and will do it again, and has no opinion about the frequency. Just the weight, just the warmth, just the insistence of a living body against another living body saying, "Here, here, here." Declan put his hand on Rex's back and held on for a moment. "Okay," he said quietly. "Okay." Rex waited until the hand on his back had stopped trembling. Then he turned and continued up the mountain slower this time, checking back every few steps in a way he didn't usually bother with on their morning walks, as if he understood that the pace needed adjusting, as if he were making the calculation in real time. They came over a final rocky shelf and Declan saw the cabin. It sat in a small clearing, perhaps 50 yards ahead, a structure so absorbed into its surroundings that for a moment his mind filed it as a natural formation, a cluster of dark rock and weathered wood shaped by decades of weather, into something that had the outline of intention without announcing it. Then he registered the shape of it more precisely. A roof steeply pitched and heavy with snow. The kind of pitch designed by someone who had lived through enough mountain winters to understand what accumulation does to an unsupported structure. A stone chimney, cold and smokeless. A covered porch barely wide enough for a single chair and a man sitting in it. A wood pile stacked along the south wall with the kind of methodical precision that spoke of long practice and long winters, in a mind that was still, despite everything, organized. The place was old, not abandoned old, but lived in old, the kind of old that accumulates when someone stays in a place through decades of weather and silence and refuses to leave when leaving would have been easier. The logs had gone dark with age, the chinking between them patched in places with a slightly different shade of mortar that marked the repairs. A crooked fence ran along one side, enclosing what must have been a garden. In other seasons, its posts leaning at angles that suggested a long argument with the mountain wind. A hand pump well stood near the far corner, its metal handle rimed with frost. Rex didn't hesitate. He crossed the clearing at a trot, mounted the porch steps, and stopped at the door. He didn't bark. He didn't growl. He sat down, his posture straight and certain, and looked back at Declan. Declan approached slowly, reading the place the way he'd been trained to read places, exits, sight lines, signs of occupancy. The footprints in the snow around the porch were several days old, half filled with new powder, which meant whoever lived here had not come out recently. The wood pile showed recent use on one-end logs removed within the past day or two based on the exposed wood's color and the lack of fresh snow accumulation in the gap. A pair of heavy boots sat just inside the porch railing, dusted with frost in the way boots get when they haven't been worn for several days. He knocked. Nothing. He knocked again, harder 3 times. Still nothing. No movement. No sound of footsteps on interior floorboards. Rex was no longer sitting. He was standing at the door, his nose working at the gap at the bottom, a low sound building in his chest that wasn't quite a whine and wasn't quite a growl. It was the sound he made when something was wrong, and he needed Declan to understand that immediately and without further delay. Declan tried the door. It opened. The smell hit him first, wood smoke and old wool, and something else beneath it, something close and medicinal. The particular smell of a body that has been indoors too long without enough air or movement. The interior was dim lit by a single window, with frost on the glass that filtered the morning light into something gray and insufficient. A wood stove in the corner had gone cold hours ago, the metal contracted and silent. A table with one chair. A shelf of books, their spines bleached by years of pale mountain light. A narrow bed along the far wall with a wool blanket folded at its foot. On the floor between the bed and the table, a man lay on his back with his arms at his sides, his eyes closed, his face the color of old ash. Declan crossed the room in 4 steps and went to his knees. The man was old, 74 perhaps, with a face that had been weathered down to its essential structure by decades of outdoor work, the kind of face that starts angular and gets more so as the years take the softness away. White hair close cropped, the kind of white that was probably gray not long ago. A jaw that had once been strong and was still present beneath the loosened skin. His breathing was shallow and fast, the breathing of a body working harder than it should have to for the simple business of drawing air. And when Declan pressed 2 fingers to the side of his neck, the pulse was there, irregular, stuttering along, in a rhythm that worried him immediately, the skipped beats of a heart that was arguing with itself about continuing. "Hey," Declan put a hand on the man's shoulder firm enough to register. "Hey, can you hear me?" A long pause, long enough that Declan began calculating options that didn't include the man regaining consciousness. Then the eyes opened, pale blue. Sharp even now, even in this, the eyes of a man whose mind was still fully operational, even as his body had decided to conduct an unauthorized shutdown. They moved to the ceiling, first oriented, then found Declan's face with the focus of someone who has woken in difficult circumstances before and knows the first priority is situational awareness. Then the gaze moved past Declan to the doorway where Rex had followed them in and was standing with his ears forward and his tail held low, in something in his posture that was neither aggression nor submission, but something older than either. Something happened in the old man's face that Declan could not immediately name. It wasn't recognition in the ordinary sense, not the recognition of a face or a name. It was something that lived below the level of conscious identification in the older parts of the brain that process familiar things before the thinking mind has a chance to weigh in. His lips moved before the sound came. Ranger. Declan turned and looked at Rex. Rex had crossed the room without being called and was standing beside the old man, now his nose inches from the weathered face, reading something in the way that dogs read things through chemistry, through frequency, through channels that humans have lost access to, or perhaps never had. His tail moved once slowly. Hey, Declan touched the man's arm gently, redirecting his attention. My dog's name is Rex. I need you to stay with me right now. Okay, can you tell me your name? The man's eyes came back to him with visible effort, as if they kept trying to return to the dog and were being overridden by the part of his mind that still understood the immediate priority. Harlan, he said. His voice was rough with disuse, the voice of a man who had gone too many days without speaking to anyone, the vocal cords unlubricated by conversation. Harlan Briggs. Okay, Harlan, I'm Declan. You're going to be all right. He wasn't certain that was true, but he'd said it to men in worse shape than this, in much worse places than this, in positions that made the floor of a mountain cabin look like a hospital suite by comparison. And he'd learned that certainty in a voice could hold a man in the world a little longer than doubt could. That sometimes the anchor was just a voice saying, stay. He went to work. There was firewood stacked on the porch, dry and ready, which told him something about the man on the floor. Even sick, even failing, he had prepared. Declan got the stove going in 10 minutes, feeding it small pieces first to build the draft, then adding larger logs once the draw was established. He found blankets in a wooden chest at the foot of the narrow bed, wool heavy smelling of cedar and long storage, and got Harlan off the floor and onto the mattress, which was no small task given that the old man was still largely dead weight, and Declan's knee was not happy with any of it, and the cabin was not designed with maneuvering room in mind. He found an ancient first aid kit under the sink, its red cross faded to pink, and a bottle of aspirin with a few tablets left. He made Harlan take 2 of them with water from the hand pump outside that he worked until the rust cleared and the water ran cold and clean and real. He propped the old man's head with the folded blanket from the bed's foot. He checked the pulse again. Still irregular, still present. He could not call for help. His phone had no signal. He had checked the moment he found Harlan on the floor, the first thing, because that was the protocol. Whatever needed to happen with what was available and what he knew. He'd worked in conditions with fewer resources than this. Rex stayed on the floor beside the bed, the entire time, his chin resting on the edge of the mattress, his eyes on Harlan's face with the specific quality of attention that working dogs give to the thing they have decided is their current responsibility. The old man's hand had found the dog's head. At some point, Declan hadn't seen it happen, had been focused on the stove and rested there with the ease of a gesture that the hand remembered performing, some muscle memory older than the gap of years. Something in Harlan's breathing eased with that contact, not dramatically, not immediately, but measurably over the following minutes. The shallow, rapid flutter deepened and slowed by degrees, as if the touch of the dog's head under his palm was recalibrating something that had been running at the wrong speed. Declan sat in the single chair and watched both of them and thought about Wren and thought about the note on the kitchen table and thought about the clouds he'd seen building to the northwest and what they were going to look like in 3 hours. Harlan slept for 2 hours. When he woke, the stove had brought the cabin up to something approaching warmth, and the gray light through the frost-edged window had taken on the flat, dense quality of late morning moving toward afternoon. The old man's eyes opened and found Declan immediately, as if he'd been expecting him, as if in whatever the sleeping mind had been doing, it had registered the presence and was not surprised to confirm it upon waking. Then they found Rex. You really called him Rex, Harlan said. His voice was stronger now, the roughness still there, but with more foundation beneath it. The military called him Rex. I inherited the name. Harlan was quiet for a moment, his hand moving slowly through the fur on Rex's neck, not petting exactly, more like inventory, the methodical movement of someone confirming something they need to confirm. He was mine, he said finally. 8 years ago. His name was Ranger. Declan leaned forward in the chair. I trained him from 8 weeks old. Harlan's voice was steadier now, the words coming with more ease, as if talking were the exercise his system needed to return to operational. Best search and rescue dog I ever worked with in 20 years of doing this work. We pulled 23 people off this mountain together over 6 years. He paused, his hands stilled in Rex's fur. We lost him in the winter of 2016. A big storm came up fast, faster than forecast. We were looking for a hiker who'd gone off trail up near Hawksbill Gap. Ranger locked onto the scent and moved forward into the whiteout. I called him back. He didn't come. His jaw tightened. We searched for 3 days, my whole team. We never found him. The cabin was very quiet. The stove ticked with the sound of expanding metal. Outside, the first light snow had begun to fall, ticking against the single window like small fingers. He was found near Route 221, Declan said slowly, working through it as he spoke. After a storm. The military records said he was approximately 2 years old and had no owner identification. He went into a civilian rescue shelter first, then was transferred into a K-9 training program. He paused. I took him when I mustered out in 2021. He's been with me since. Harlan looked at him for a long moment. You were military. Navy, 15 years. Harlan nodded once, the nod of a man filing information rather than reacting to it. He looked back at Rex. His hand moved to the dog's right ear, and his thumb found the scar along the outer edge, the thin pale line, and rested there, holding it, taking some reading from it that Declan didn't have access to. I know this scar, Harlan said quietly. He caught it on a barbed wire fence when he was 4 months old. I was furious with myself for not checking the fence line before I let him work in that area. It was a small cut, but it bled more than it should have, and he didn't complain once. He kept his thumb on the scar. 8 years, he said, more to himself than to Declan. 8 years and he comes back. Rex hadn't moved. He stayed beside the bed with his chin on the mattress and his eyes on Harlan's face, patient and present, and certain with the particular certainty of a dog who has done something complicated and arrived where it intended to arrive and finds the destination exactly as expected. Declan said nothing for a while. He sat with the weight of the moment and let it be what it was. Outside, the snow was thickening. He tried twice more to get a signal on his phone. Nothing. He went to the porch and looked northwest and confirmed what he'd suspected. The clouds had come fully down the ridge now, and the light had gone flat and dense, and the snow was coming steadily. Whatever the mountain was going to do with the rest of this day, it had made its decision. He went back inside and told Harlan he was staying the night. The old man didn't argue. That more than anything told Declan how depleted he was. Harlan Briggs had the bearing of a man who had spent 7 decades not asking for help and not accepting it when offered, and had built an entire life on the premise that self-sufficiency was both a virtue and a point of pride. The fact that he lay back against the pillow without protest was its own kind of emergency indicator. Declan sent a text to his neighbor, June Alderman, asking her to check on Wren. The message sat in the phone's outbox, unsent, waiting for a signal that might not come until morning. He sent it anyway because sometimes signals found their moment. Then he put more wood in the stove and found a can of soup in the cabinet above the sink, vegetable. The label faded and heated it on the single gas burner and brought a bowl to Harlan and ate his own standing at the window, watching the snow come down in the failing light. They talked through the evening in the way that men talk when they are both private people, and the night is long in pieces, with silences between that neither of them felt the need to fill with unnecessary sound. Harlan talked about the mountain rescue team he had run for 20 years out of the ranger station in Linville, about the people they'd pulled out of ravines and off ledges and from the frozen creek beds where the cold took them faster than anyone expected, because people always underestimated the cold in these mountains, always thought they had more time than they did. About his wife, Margaret, who had died of cancer 11 years ago, and the specific way the world had changed shape after that, not collapsed, but changed the way a room changes when the furniture is rearranged, everything familiar, but in the wrong configuration. After Margaret died, he had let the work wind down, let the team disband gradually, one member at a time, moving on to other work or other places. Let the connections to town grow thin, and then thinner, and then essentially disappear. Phone calls going unreturned, invitations declining, and then ceasing. He had come up here with his view and his tools and his grief and a conviction, whether conscious or not, that solitude was what remained and what he deserved. When Ranger disappeared, the last thread snapped. He had been here alone for 8 years. The few people who had known where to find him had mostly stopped trying, and he had not made it easier for them by trying to be found. Declan listened. He was good at listening. 15 years of working in small units in close quarters had taught him that the man who talked was usually telling you something more important than the words he was using, that the real communication was in the shape of what was said and the gaps around it. He could hear what Harlan was not saying. What Harlan was not saying was that he had come up this mountain to disappear. Not dramatically, not in the way that announced itself or invited intervention. In the quiet, patient way of a man who has set down the reasons to continue and is simply waiting for the natural conclusion to arrive on its own schedule. The way you let a fire burn down when you're finished with it. Declan filed this. He would come back to it. "What about you?" Harlan asked at some point in the evening, his soup bowl empty on the table beside him. Rex asleep across his feet with the comfortable weight of a dog who has decided where he is sleeping and considers the matter settled. "What brings a man like you to a cabin in the Blue Ridge with a little girl and a retired military dog?" Declan looked at the stove for a long moment. "My wife died," he said, 2 years ago. Car accident on the highway." "I'm sorry. Her name was Nora." He hadn't said her name out loud to anyone outside of family in a long time. It sat differently in the stranger's cabin in the dark with the snow coming down. Outside, not worse exactly. Different. More like the actual word and less like the place the word used to be. She grew up near here. She loved these mountains the way some people love specific places, not as scenery, but as something she was part of. It seemed right to bring Ren here, to the place Nora knew. "Your daughter, 8 years old. He stopped. He thought about how to say what he wanted to say and decided there wasn't a way that didn't give more than he meant to give a man he'd known for 8 hours. "She's the reason," he said finally, not elaborating, not needing to. Harlan nodded as if the two words were entirely sufficient, as if he understood exactly what they contained. The fire burned lower in the stove, and Declan fed it another log, and the snow hissed against the window, and Rex snored softly at the foot of the old man's bed, and outside the Blue Ridge Mountains held the whole dark world in their cold, patient arms. It was later, deep into the quiet hours, the snow still falling, Harlan breathing steadily in sleep, that Declan noticed the drawer. He had been moving around the cabin quietly, doing the small, useful things that kept his hands occupied when his mind wouldn't settle into rest. He'd stacked more wood just inside the door so it would be dry and accessible in the morning. He'd refilled the water pitcher at the hand pump, working the handle slowly to avoid waking Harlan. He'd checked on Rex and on the fire and on the old man's breathing and found all three satisfactory. The drawer was in the table beside Harlan's bed, a single narrow drawer with a simple wooden pull, the kind of table a person builds for themselves because they need a surface, and function matters more than form. It was open perhaps an inch the way a drawer goes when the wood has expanded and contracted through too many seasons, and the runner no longer allows it to close flush. Inside the gap, visible in the low firelight, was the corner of a manila envelope, and beneath it the edge of a photograph. He didn't open the drawer. That was not something he would do. But he stood in the dim cabin with the fire ticking and the snow falling outside, and the old man asleep and Rex pressed warm against his legs, and he looked at that inch of open drawer and felt the particular sensation familiar from years of operational experience, of standing at the edge of something significant. The feeling was not premonition exactly. It was pattern recognition. The feeling that the shape of things is about to change and you are standing at the hinge point. He didn't take the step, not yet. He went back to the chair and sat with Rex's chin on his knee and watched the fire work through the wood and waited for morning with the patience of a man who has learned that some things can only be properly understood in daylight, that the dark makes everything either too large or too small, and that clarity is a function of light. Outside, the Blue Ridge held its breath under the new snow, enormous and old, and entirely indifferent to the small dramas of the creatures on its slopes. And Rex, asleep now, his paws moving in some private dream, made a sound in his throat, not a whine, not quite a bark, but something older than either, something that sounded in the silence of the mountain cabin, almost like a door opening. Part 2. The secret in the cabin. The drawer was still open an inch when morning came. Declan had watched the light change through the frost-edged window, the deep black of mountain night softening first to a dark gray that was barely distinguishable from it, then to a gray that had some blue in it, then to the pale flat white of a winter dawn after heavy snowfall, when the sky and the ground are the same color, and the world has a temporary quality as if it is waiting to be told what it is. He had slept in the chair for perhaps 3 hours, Rex across his feet, the stove burning low. He had woken twice in the night and fed it and checked on Harlan and listened to the silence and gone back to the chair. Now the cabin held the particular stillness of early morning in the mountains after a storm. The snow had stopped. The world outside the window was remade, every surface covered, every edge, softened the clearing in front of the cabin, a field of unbroken white that made the tree line look darker and closer than it had been. Harlan was awake. Declan registered it before the old man spoke, some shift in the quality of his breathing, the subtle change in a person's stillness when consciousness has returned and is choosing to remain quiet for a moment before announcing itself. "You didn't sleep," Harlan said. "I slept enough." Harlan turned his head and looked at him with those pale blue eyes which had lost none of their sharpness overnight. "You were in a chair all night with your back to the wall watching the door." "That's not sleeping. That's standing watch." "Old habit," Declan said. "Habits like that don't stay habits. They become character." Harlan pushed himself up to a seated position with the careful effort of a man reassessing his body's current capabilities. "You've been doing it a long time." "Long enough." Declan got up and put water on it for coffee and found a tin of grounds in the cabinet that was old but still functional, and they sat with their mugs in the early light, Harlan upright in the bed now, color beginning to return to his face in degrees. Rex resettled at the foot of the mattress, as if he had never moved, and the morning came in around them without hurry, in the way mountain mornings do after storms, as if the violence of the previous night has earned a peaceful day, and both parties understand the arrangement. Harlan's hands were steadier. His breathing had deepened overnight, the shallow, rapid flutter replaced by something more, even more grounded. Whatever had brought him to the floor the previous morning had retreated to a manageable distance. Declan knew enough about the physiology of cardiac events to understand that retreat was not resolution. The underlying condition was still present, still working, but the immediate crisis had passed. They talked again. Differently than the night before, with less caution, the way people talk after they have already shown each other something true, and the defensive postures have become unnecessary. Harlan talked about the specific morning they had lost Ranger, about the way the storm had come in from the northwest faster than any of the forecasts had suggested, the way visibility had dropped in under 20 minutes from acceptable to almost nothing, the way Ranger had locked onto a scent trail and accelerated into the white with the absolute commitment of a trained dog that has found its purpose and is executing it. And then the way the dog simply had not come back when called. "I've gone over it 10,000 times, Harlan said. He was looking at Rex, who was looking back at him with the patient attention of a dog who understands more than he is able to communicate and has made peace with that limitation. "What I should have done differently," Whether I should have kept him on lead in those conditions, whether he found the hiker and then couldn't navigate back through the whiteout, whether he paused, set his mug down carefully, whether he suffered out there. The military records say he was in good physical condition when the shelter found him, Declan said. No injuries beyond minor paw abrasions. They estimated he had been on his own for several weeks, but his weight was within normal range. He'd been eating. Harlan was quiet for a moment. He looked at Rex with something shifting in his expression, some long-held weight recalibrating. So he survived the storm. He survived the storm. The old man's jaw worked once, not in the way of someone fighting emotion, but in the way of someone receiving information that has required 8 years of uncertainty as its price and is now finally being delivered. He set his mug down on the table with the careful deliberateness of a man whose hands need something deliberate to do. That helps, he said finally. After 8 years, that helps considerably more than I expected it to. Rex shifted on the mattress and placed his chin on Harlan's knee, and the old man's hand went to the dog's head with the ease and automaticity of a gesture that the hand remembered making that was returning to a groove worn into it long ago. It was mid-morning when Declan's phone found a single bar of signal, brief, unreliable, lasting perhaps 30 seconds before vanishing again. Long enough for his outgoing message to June to transmit and for 2 incoming texts to push through. The first was from June Wren's fine. Made pancakes. Don't rush. The second was from Wren herself, composed with the large, careful letters of a child who has recently decided that punctuation is optional and capitalization is for people with more time. Dad Rex is okay, right? Tell him I said hi. Also, June, let me have 2 pancakes. Declan read both messages twice and felt something loosen in his chest by a measurable degree. He showed Harlan Wren's text without quite meaning to held the phone out and then wasn't immediately sure what the impulse was. Harlan read it and something changed in his face, in the small, almost invisible way of a man who has not encountered a child's handwriting in a long time and finds it unexpectedly moving the large, uneven letters, the collapsed punctuation the priorities so clearly stated. How long has she been without her mother? Harlan asked. 2 years. How's she managing? Declan considered this with the honesty it deserved. Better than I am, he said, which I've decided to interpret as a good sign rather than an indictment. Harlan made a sound that was close to a laugh, or what a laugh sounded like in a man who had gone a long time without practicing it. Children are more resilient than we have any right to expect, he said. It's either evidence of good design or good luck, and I've never been able to decide which. She talks to Nora sometimes, at night mostly, just talks like she's still in the room somewhere and can hear her. Declan looked at his mug. I don't know whether to be concerned about that or grateful. Be grateful, Harlan said without hesitation, without qualification. She's figured out something it takes most adults decades to arrive at if they ever do. He paused. The people we lose don't stop being present. They change the form they come in. That's all. The words settled in the cabin, and Declan let them sit without answering because they didn't require an answer. They required sitting with. He found the field log by accident. He was looking for more coffee or for something to do with his hands, which had been increasingly restless as the morning lengthened and his mind kept returning to what needed to be said to Harlan before they left the mountain. He opened the cabinet above the sink and worked through it methodically. More canned goods, a second tin of grounds, a small bottle of aspirin, a folded Blue Ridge Parkway map with handwritten notations in the margins. And on the bottom shelf, wedged behind a stack of water-stained paperbacks, a thick 3-ring binder with a handwritten label on the spine, Blue Ridge Rescue Field Logs 2010 to 2016. He took it down without thinking, the automatic reach of hands that recognize something before the mind is caught up. He meant only to look at the cover. He told himself this afterward, and it was mostly accurate. The log was dense with handwritten entries in a cramped, precise script that matched the methodical stacking of the woodpile and the organized arrangement of the canned goods, the handwriting of a mind that organized things as a default that found clarity and order. Dates, weather conditions, terrain descriptions, personnel lists, names of people found, and names of people the mountain kept. Small margin notations, good visibility, East Ridge accessible. Icing on Upper Tanawa, proceed with caution. Ranger tracked above tree line, located subject in 34 minutes. He turned pages slowly, reading the compressed history of 20 years of work, lives pulled back from the edge, and lives that the edge kept rendered in the spare functional language of field reports. The entries for 2016 were sparse compared to earlier years. Fewer callouts, shorter notes, as if the man writing them had already begun the process of withdrawal, had already begun to disengage from the work that had defined him. The last entry was dated November 14th, 2016. Storm moved faster than predicted. Call out single hiker female late 20s went off trail near Rough Ridge. Ranger on point. Lost contact with Ranger in whiteout approximately 1340 hours. Search conducted November 14th through November 17th. Ranger not recovered. Hiker located by Park Service on Route 221, condition stable. Declan stopped. He read the last line again. Hiker located by Park Service on Route 221, condition stable. He read the date. November 14th, 2016. A female hiker late 20s. Rough Ridge. Route 221. Route 221 ran directly below this mountain. It was the road he drove every day from his cabin to Linville. It was the road Nora had loved to take on autumn evenings because of the specific way the light came through the trees at the curve above the river. The road she had described taking on a hiking trip years before they were married in a winter that had turned suddenly and badly. He stood at the counter. He was a man trained in the discipline of not jumping to conclusions, trained in the understanding that conclusions reached prematurely without adequate verification could be as dangerous as the situations they were meant to resolve. He was a man who checked his footing before committing his weight. He turned and looked at Harlan. This entry, he said. His voice was level. He had made it level. November 14, 2016. The female hiker on Route 221. Harlan looked at him. Something shifted in the old man's expression, not surprise. The expression of a man who has been waiting for a particular door to open and is not entirely certain he is ready for what comes through it. What about her? Do you remember her? Her description? Harlan was quiet for a moment, considering. I didn't see her myself, he said carefully. I was still on the mountain searching for Ranger when the Park Service found her. I got the report secondhand. He paused. Dark hair, blue jacket, mid to late 20s. She'd been in the storm for several hours before the dog found her and got her to the road. Declan's hands were very steady. He was concentrating on keeping them that way. My wife hiked this area, he said. Before we were married, she talked about a storm, a bad one, a whiteout, getting turned around on a ridge trail and losing her bearings, finding her way to the road. He stopped, started again. She said a dog found her. She described him for years afterward. The size, the markings, the scar on the ear. He looked at Rex. I never thought to connect it. There was no reason to connect it. The cabin went completely silent. Rex lifted his head from the mattress. His ears came forward. He looked between the two men with the focused attention of something that registers the significance of a moment before the humans in it have finished processing it. Harlan Briggs looked at Declan Merritt, and neither man spoke because some moments require their own silence, as the entry fee, a pause long enough to let the weight of what is being said settle to its proper depth before anyone tries to respond to it. She never found out who the dog belonged to, Declan said finally. His voice had changed despite his discipline. Lower, more careful. She tried. She described going back to the trailhead, asking around, calling the Park Service. Nobody could tell her. She carried it for years, the not knowing. He looked at Rex. I didn't make the connection because why would I? There was no thread to follow. Because why would you? Harlan said quietly. Because why would you? He went out to the porch to call Nora's mother. He stood in the new snow in his boots without a coat because he needed the cold and the open sky, and he needed to be somewhere other than inside the cabin for this particular phone call. The mountains around the clearing were white and enormous and silent under the gray sky. Eleanor Calloway answered on the third ring, her voice carrying the particular warmth of a woman in her 60s who answers every call as if she has been hoping for it, not desperate, not anxious, simply genuinely pleased to hear from the people she loves. Declan, is everything all right? I need to ask you something about Nora, about a hiking trip she took in November of 2016. A pause brief. The storm, she said. She told you about it. She called me the day after. She was shaken, which wasn't easy to do, your wife. She didn't get rattled easily, and she didn't talk about being frightened generally. Eleanor's voice shifted slightly into the register of someone handling a memory with care. She said she got completely turned around in a whiteout on one of the ridge trails. She was genuinely lost for a while, she said, and then a dog appeared. Declan closed his eyes. She said the dog stayed close, kept pace with her, led her down through the trees when she couldn't see more than a few feet ahead, as if it knew the route, as if it had a destination in mind. When she reached Route 221, she said she tried to hold on to him, tried to find a collar, an ID tag, anything, but he pulled away and went back into the trees. Eleanor paused. Did she describe him? I need you to tell me. Big German shepherd, dark coat tan markings. She said he had a scar on one ear. She remembered it specifically because she tried to find the tag near that ear and felt a scar instead. Another pause, and when Eleanor continued, her voice had gone softer, as if she were carrying something. She never forgot that dog, Declan. She talked about him several times over the years. She said he was the calmest thing she had ever seen in a genuinely dangerous situation, like he had already decided how it was going to end and was just patiently executing the plan. Declan stood in the snow and looked through the cabin's small window at the interior at Harlan, sitting upright in the bed at Rex beside him, the two of them in the same quiet orbit they had been in since the previous night, as if 9 years of separation were a tide that had gone out and was simply now coming back in. Why are you asking this now, Eleanor said. Because I think I know who the dog was, Declan said, and I think I know where he came from. He stood on the porch a moment longer after the call ended, letting the cold do its work, letting the mountain air clear the inside of his head. Then he went back in. He told Harlan what Eleanor had said, working through it in the order it had come without editorializing. When he finished, Harlan sat for a moment without speaking. Then he reached under the mattress, not into the drawer, but under the mattress itself, where the edge lifted slightly on the far side, and withdrew a manila envelope. He held it without speaking for a moment. A woman came to the cabin, he said. Spring of 2021. I almost didn't answer the door. I had stopped answering the door for most purposes by then. He looked at the envelope in his hands. She was dark-haired. She was wearing a blue jacket, even in April, which I noticed because April on this mountain still has cold mornings, and most people underestimate that. She said she had been looking for the owner of a search and rescue dog for nearly 5 years. Said the dog had saved her life in a storm near Rough Ridge in 2016, and she had never been able to identify who he belonged to, and she had decided she needed to find out. Declan sat very still. I told her about Ranger, Harlan continued. His voice was even, but his hands on the envelope were not. About training him and working with him and losing him in that storm. She cried. Not dramatically, she wasn't a dramatic person from what I could see in an afternoon. She just went quiet and her eyes filled, and she didn't make a production of it. He looked up at Declan. We talked for most of the afternoon about loss and about mountains and about the specific kind of loyalty that working dogs have that's different from any other kind. About Margaret. about the rescue team. She was remarkable. The kind of person who reminds you that the world keeps producing people of real quality and you don't always get to meet them. He held the envelope out. She left 2 letters. One for me, which is here, and one for you. The last 3 words landed differently than the others. They had a different way, but she said she didn't know if she'd ever be able to give it to you directly, Harlan continued. She said there were things she'd been trying to find words for and hadn't managed to say face to face. She left your name on the back and your address. She said if she didn't give it to you herself, she hoped someday you'd find it here. He paused. I had no way of knowing there was no way to connect. She died 6 months after she came here, Declan said. Harlan's face changed, not much, but the expression of a man who has received news that reorganizes something in him, that takes a piece of information he had and replaces it with a heavier one. I'm sorry, he said. Simple words simply meant. Declan took the envelope. His name was on the back in Nora's handwriting, the specific pressure she always put on a pen, the particular loop on the capital D that he had teased her about once, and that she had said was how she'd always written it, and she wasn't changing it now, and she hadn't. He knew her handwriting better than he knew his own. He had not seen it in 2 years. He stood up. I'll be outside, he said. The snow on the porch reached the tops of his boots. He didn't register it. He stood at the railing and looked out at the white clearing and the dark tree line and the mountains rising into a pale sky that had cleared after the storm, enormous and blue and cold and indifferent in the way that mountains are indifferent, which is not the same as uncaring more. Like the indifference of something that will be here long after all of this has resolved itself one way or another. He opened the envelope. 2 pages folded together, the paper slightly worn at the folds from being handled before being put away. He had not seen her handwriting in 2 years. He stood in the snow and read. She wrote the way she talked, directly with the occasional sideways movement into something that was almost poetry when she wasn't watching herself do it. She wrote about the storm. She wrote about how frightened she had actually been, genuinely the kind of fear she had never told him about, because she knew he carried enough of his own, and she had always tried to be the place where his could rest rather than adding to it. She wrote about the dog appearing out of the white calm in a way I've never seen a living thing be calm. Deck, like he had already decided how this was going to end and was just waiting for me to get there with him. She wrote about finding Harlan, about the afternoon in the cabin and the conversation about loss and mountains and the strangeness of what endures, about driving home feeling like she'd been handed something she didn't yet have the right frame for. And then she wrote about him. There are things I've been trying to say to you for years that come out wrong when I'm looking at you, because you look at me and I forget everything I meant to say, and it seems like enough just you looking at me and me knowing what that means. So I'm writing it down in case the right moment never comes, which is likely because that's how we are. We just keep living and assuming the words will find their moment eventually. You are a good man, Declan. I need you to know that I know that. And I need you to know that I've known it every day since I met you, not in spite of the things you've seen and done and carried because of them, because of what you chose to do with them, because of who you kept being when it would have been so much easier not to. Take care of Ren, not perfectly. Perfectly is not the point and never was, and anyone who told you it was lied to you. Just present, just there. That is everything she needs and everything I've ever needed, and I should have said it more often out loud instead of assuming you knew. The dog found me in the dark and led me out, and I've thought about that 100 times. I think some things find us when we need them. I think some things know where we're supposed to go even when we can't see it ourselves. I think you should trust that. I think you should follow whatever leads. The last line, I love you. I love you. I'm sorry I didn't say it more. I'll find a way to keep saying it. Declan stood on the porch of a stranger's cabin in the Blue Ridge Mountains and read his dead wife's handwriting, and did not look at the sky, and did not look at the tree line, and did not look at anything at all for a long time. Rex was beside him. He hadn't heard the dog come out, but Rex was there, pressed against his legs, with the full weight of himself steady and warm and immovable, the way he was immovable when he had decided this was where he was needed. Declan's hand found the back of the dog's neck and held on. He cried. Properly, finally, not the managed, functional grief he had conducted in front of Wren for 2 years, not the late-night silent variety that happened in the dark and was finished before morning, but the real kind, the unwitnessed kind, the kind that knows no one is watching and expands to fill the available space. Rex stood in the snow and held the weight of it with him and waited with the absolute patience of something that does not experience time the way humans do and is therefore never in a hurry and never has anywhere better to be. When the breathing steadied, Declan straightened. He stood for a moment in the cold. The mountains were still there. The sky was still there. Rex was still there. He folded the letter carefully and put it in the inner pocket of his jacket close to him. Then he went back inside. Harlan looked at his face and looked away, the quick, deliberate look away of a man giving someone the dignity of not being observed, returning from somewhere private. Declan sat down in the chair. He folded his hands loosely together. "Thank you," he said, "for keeping it." "She trusted me with it," Harlan said, simply without elaboration because it was complete as stated. They were quiet for a while. The stove worked steadily. Rex settled on the floor between them, his chin on his paws, his eyes moving between the two men with quiet surveillance. Declan had been building towards something all morning. He could feel the shape of it, the thing that needed to be said that he had been finding reasons to delay. He had been in enough difficult conversations to know that delay was almost never the answer. He stopped delaying. "When did you know your heart was failing?" he asked. Harlan looked at him steadily. He didn't perform surprise or ask how Declan knew. He simply calculated something behind his pale eyes and then answered. 8 months ago, he said. A cardiologist in Morganton. He explained what was happening and outlined what could be done about it. And you came back up here. I came back up here. Alone. I've been alone for 8 years. That's not an answer to what I said. Declan kept his voice level, not hard, not cold, but direct in the way that men who have been in difficult places together can sometimes be direct with each other. You received a medical diagnosis that required intervention, and you came up here alone with no communication, no emergency contact, and no access to the care you needed. That's not a living arrangement. That's a decision. Harlan's jaw set, the expression of a man whose pride has been located and pressed on. I'm 74 years old. I've spent the better part of my adult life pulling other people off this mountain. I believe I've earned the right to decide how I spend what remains of mine. You have, Declan said, absolutely. But there's a difference between choosing how to live and choosing not to. And what you were doing up here wasn't living. It was waiting. He leaned forward, elbows on his knees. I've seen what waiting looks like. I've seen it in men who had more reasons to stay than you do and still chose the waiting. And I know you're not that man. So I want to understand what broke. The cabin held its silence. Harlan looked at Rex for a long time at the Yeet lying between them, his silver muzzle, his scarred ear, his absolute unconcerned presence. Then he looked at Declan. Ranger disappeared, he said, and before that Margaret died, and the team disbanded, and one by one He stopped. His hands on the blanket were very still. The reasons got quieter, he said, and eventually there was just the quiet. He looked at the window, the white outside it, the pale sky above the ridge. There's no one left who needs me, he said. That's the plain truth of it. A man can carry most things if he feels needed. If that goes, he didn't complete the sentence. Declan was quiet for a moment. My daughter is 8 years old, he said. She lost her mother 2 years ago. She needs someone who knows this mountain not as a place to visit, but as a place to understand. Someone who can teach her how to read it, how to move through it, how to respect it. Things I don't know how to teach because I came to this place as a stranger and I'm still learning it. He paused. She needs someone who knew Nora even briefly. even for an afternoon, because I've been trying to hold on to Nora for 2 years with nothing but memory and memory." He stopped. His hands tightened together once and released. "Memory gets thinner," he said. "It gets thinner and there's nothing you can do about it, and it's the thing I'm most afraid of." Harlan looked at him for a long moment. Something in the old man's face shifted, not dramatically, not with any performance. Simply the way a door becomes open, the way a window becomes open. Something that had been held fixed and certain for a long time becoming not uncertain but available. "She seemed happy," Harlan said quietly. "When she was here, she talked about you for most of the afternoon. She seemed like a woman who knew exactly the value of what she had and was grateful for all of it without qualification." He paused. "She said you worried too much about whether you were enough. She said you were." Declan closed his eyes just for a moment, just long enough. "Come down with me," he said. "Not permanently, not as anything except a next step, just to see a doctor to understand what the options actually are. And then you decide with real information, with real choices, instead of up here alone, with the stove running low and no signal and no one who knows where to find you." Harlan looked at him for a long time. Something moved through the old man's face that was too complex to name, not simple resolution, but something that had multiple components, that had been assembled from several different materials over several decades and was now being examined in new light. "Your neighbor," he said finally, "June. She made your daughter 2 pancakes this morning." Declan frowned slightly. "How do you... You showed me the text. You didn't notice you were doing it." Harlan looked at Rex. "You've been sharing things without meaning to since you walked through my door. That means you're lonely too, more than you've said." He said it without accusation, without any particular weight, simply as an observation that seemed true and worth stating. Declan said nothing because it was accurate. "All right," Harlan said, "I'll come down." He said it the way a man says something he has already decided, that was decided somewhere in the hours just past and is now simply being spoken aloud for the first time. "One condition." "Name it." "You bring me back when the weather turns. This is my mountain. I want to be on it." "Done," Declan said. Rex stood up from the floor, stretched forward with his front legs extended and his back arched in the full body stretch of a dog declaring itself ready, and then shook himself from nose to tail, the complete committed shake that Declan had come to recognize as Rex's signal that one thing was finished and another was beginning. Harlan watched it. Something changed in his face, the first thing that had changed in it, that wasn't grief or endurance or the careful management of pain. Something that was almost not quite yet, but almost close enough to be its cousin. Something that was almost joy. "He always did that," Harlan said quietly. "Every time we were about to go to work. Every single time." They came down the mountain in the afternoon, the three of them. Declan went first on the steeper sections and reached back to take Harlan's arm on the rock faces and the icy descents, and the old man accepted the help without protest, which cost him something, and they both understood what it cost, and neither mentioned it. Rex moved between them ahead when the path was clear, back beside Harlan, when the footing demanded judgment, back beside Declan, when the slope required 2 good legs and Declan was managing with 1.5. They were an hour from the valley cabin when Declan's phone found a signal and buzzed with accumulated messages. Among them was a voicemail from a number he didn't recognize. A ranger station coordinator named Francis Aldrich, calling on behalf of the regional land office, informing Harlan Briggs that the injunction period on the federal land parcel designated for his residence had concluded and that he would be required to vacate the premises within 30 days or face removal proceedings. Declan listened to the message twice. He put the phone in his pocket. He looked at the back of Harlan's head, the white hair, the straight spine, the set of shoulders that had not lost their shape despite 8 years of solitude and a failing heart, and a mountain that didn't care about any of it either way. He thought about a woman in a blue jacket finding her way out of a blizzard because a dog had decided she was worth the effort. He thought about a letter folded in his jacket pocket that had waited 3 years to be read by the person it was written for. He thought about his daughter at June's table with 2 pancakes talking to her mother in the quiet way she had, keeping the connection alive by the sheer force of refusing to let it be otherwise. "Harlan," he said. The old man turned. "We've got 30 days, Declan said, "and I spent 15 years in the Navy. I know a few things about not surrendering ground." Harlan looked at him for a long moment. Then, for the first time since Declan had found him on the floor of the cabin, for the first time perhaps in considerably longer than that, Harlan Briggs smiled. Small, real. The smile of a man who has just remembered that he has something worth fighting for, and who finds the memory of it both surprising and entirely welcome. Rex looked up from the snow. His ears came forward. He looked at Declan, then at Harlan, then back at Declan with the expression of a dog that has done a long and complicated piece of work and finds the result satisfactory. Below them, through the bare winter trees, the valley was beginning to catch the late afternoon light. Gold and cold and brief, the way winter light in the mountains is always brief, arriving late, leaving early, but while it's there, entirely itself. Part 3, The Way Home. The drive down from the mountain took 40 minutes on roads the snowplow had reached sometime in the early hours, leaving behind the gray slush of a rural highway after a winter storm, passable but honest about the conditions that had produced it. Harlan sat in the passenger seat of Declan's truck with Rex between them. On the bench seat, the old man's hand resting on the dog's back with the ease of something relearned, rather than learned for the first time, a posture the hand remembered, even if the years had tried to make it forget. He looked out the window at the passing tree line, at the ridges going past their familiar shapes under new snow. The expression on his face was not one Declan could easily name, not quite recognition and not quite reunion. Something in between. The expression of a man who has been in one place long enough that returning to the world of other things requires a recalibration. Neither of them spoke much on the drive. The silence between them had changed quality since the first one, thicker, now more inhabited the silence of two people who have told each other true things and no longer require the maintenance of ordinary conversation as a cover for the absence of real communication. June Alderman was on Declan's porch when they pulled in coat, buttoned to the collar, a mug in both hands, watching the truck come up the drive with the patience of a woman who has lived next door to other people's difficulties for 30 years and knows that presence is usually more useful than questions. She looked at Harlan getting carefully out of the passenger side and looked at Declan once briefly and said nothing except, "There's soup on your stove. Wren's in the barn with the chickens." "Thank you, June." "Feed your guest," she said, and went back across the property line. Without further comment, her boots leaving clean prints in the new snow. Harlan watched her go. "Good neighbor," he said. "The best kind." Declan agreed. "The kind that shows up and doesn't ask you to explain why." Wren came out of the barn at a run, her boots punching uneven prints in the snow, her coat unzipped despite the cold because she had been 8 years old for 4 months and had not yet accepted that temperature was something that applied to her specifically. She stopped when she saw Harlan, just stopped mid-stride and looked at him with the direct, unhurried assessment of her mother's eyes, dark taking the measure of things without apology or performance. She looked at Rex, who had gone immediately to her and was pushing his nose into her mittened hands with the enthusiasm of a dog who has been away from his preferred small human for longer than he finds acceptable. "Who's he?" she asked, meaning Harlan. Her manners had not yet caught up with her directness, and Declan had mostly decided this was not the worst trade. "Harlan Briggs," Declan said. "He lives up the mountain. He's going to stay with us a few days." Wren processed this with the serious, uncomplicated efficiency of a child who has not yet learned to pretend she isn't evaluating someone. Then she looked at Harlan and said with the tone of someone issuing a judgment, "Rex likes you." "He and I are old friends," Harlan said. "We lost track of each other for a while." Wren absorbed this. "That happens," she said with the authority of someone who has considered the subject. Mom said, the small adjustment came the practice tense shift that still cost her something every time. Mom said the people you're supposed to know, you find them, even if it takes a while. Harlan looked at her for a moment with something moving behind his pale eyes that he did not put into words. Your mother was right, he said, simply as a statement of fact. Wren seemed satisfied. There's soup, she said, and went inside Rex at her heels with his tail high. Declan and Harlan stood on the porch for a moment. How old did you say she was? Harlan said. 8. She's older than 8. I know, I think grief does that. Declan looked at the door Wren had gone through. She carries it differently than I expected. She's not diminished by it. She's just more. Some people are, Harlan said. It's not something you can predict or teach. It either happens or it doesn't. They went inside. They ate soup at the kitchen table. The 4 of them, which was a number Declan registered consciously, the table had not held 4 people in 2 years. The chair at the far end had been angled slightly away from the table since November of 2022, not quite pushed in, not quite pulled out, occupying the territory between use and absence that Declan had never consciously maintained but had never changed either. A kind of preservation that had no language to explain itself. Wren pulled the chair in and put Harlan in it without ceremony because she was 8 and had not learned to leave empty chairs alone, and Declan found that he was grateful for the specific quality of 8-year-old obliviousness to certain kinds of weight. Conversation over dinner was mostly Wren introducing Harlan to the chickens by name, by personality, by the specific interpersonal disputes they had conducted with each other over the course of the winter. Harlan listened with the complete unperformed attention of a man who has not had anyone to listen to for a long time and finds the experience of listening to a child talking about chickens to be, against all expectation, genuinely engaging. He asked questions at the right moments. He remembered names. He asked a follow-up question about one particular chicken's ongoing territorial dispute that indicated he had been paying careful attention to the beginning of the story. At some point, Wren pushed her chair back and reached up to the shelf beside the table and brought down a notebook. Declan recognized its spiral-bound green cover, Nora's handwriting on the label sketches Miski. He had not opened it since Nora died. He had put it on the shelf where she had kept it because he hadn't known where else it belonged, and he hadn't been able to look inside it, and he hadn't been able to throw it away. I found this in Mom's stuff, Wren said, opening it with the matter-of-fact confidence of a person who has already decided the contents are meant to be shared and is proceeding accordingly. She drew a lot. I didn't know she drew. Did you know she drew, Dad? I knew she sketched sometimes, Declan said carefully. I didn't know how much. Wren turned pages with the same directness she brought to everything. She stopped and turned the notebook to face Harlan. It was a dog, rendered in pencil with considerably more skill than Declan had known Nora possessed, the broad chest, the alert ears, the specific quality of attention in the eyes drawn by someone working from a memory they had decided to preserve. A German Shepherd, accurate in its proportions, careful in its details. At the bottom of the page in Nora's handwriting, Blue Ridge, November 2016. He knew the way. Declan looked at the drawing. Harlan looked at the drawing. Rex, positioned beside the table in the hope of soup, lifted his head and appeared to look at it also. Wren looked between the 2 men, reading their faces with her mother's precision. You know this dog, she said, not a question, an observation stated as fact. Yes, Harlan said. His voice was steady, but only barely. I know this dog very well. Mom kept redrawing him, Wren said, turning a few more pages to show another version, and then another, the same dog rendered several times from slightly different angles, each one careful and specific. She had him in 3 different notebooks. She said he saved her life once, and she never got to say thank you to the person he belonged to. She looked at Harlan directly. Are you the person he belonged to? Harlan looked at Wren for a long moment. Yes, he said. I am. Wren nodded once decisively. Good, she said. Then she did get to say thank you, just not directly. She closed the notebook and put it back on the shelf with the care of someone returning something to its proper place. Mom always said things find a way to be completed. She picked up her spoon and went back to her soup. The table held its silence for a moment, and in that silence, Declan felt something shift, some weight that had been unevenly distributed for 2 years, finding a new arrangement. Not lighter, better balanced. The difference between a load that is too heavy and a load that is distributed correctly, which can be the same weight and feel entirely different. The medical appointment was 2 days later at a cardiology practice in Morganton. The cardiologist was a precise, unhurried woman named Dr. Elaine Pruitt, who reviewed Harlan's file with the expression of someone who has long since made peace with the specific category of patient who receives a serious diagnosis and then disappears for 8 months. She examined him for 40 minutes. She ordered tests. She spoke to him without condescension and without false reassurance, which Declan, sitting with Rex in the waiting room, while Wren drew in her notebook beside him, found reassuring in itself. Harlan came out an hour and 20 minutes later and sat down beside Declan with the careful movement of a man who is conserving energy and has learned to do so. The valve situation is manageable, he said. She wants to do a procedure, outpatient, 2 weeks from now if I agree to it. Do you agree to it? Harlan was quiet for a moment. She said her exact words that living alone at altitude with no emergency contact and irregular access to adequate nutrition was aggressively inadvisable. He paused. I found the precision of the phrasing convincing. She sounds like someone who's been telling difficult truths to difficult people for a long time and has found the language that works, Declan said. That's approximately what I thought. Harlan looked at his hands. She said if the procedure goes well, there's no medical reason I can't continue living on the mountain, with appropriate modifications. What kind? Emergency satellite communication device, regular medical check-ins, someone who knows where I am and can reach me if I don't make contact on schedule. He paused. Someone who knows where to find me if needed. I know where to find you, Declan said. Harlan looked at him sideways. You'd make the trip up regularly. That's a significant commitment. I was going to do it regardless, Declan said. You just made it official. Wren looked up from her notebook. I'm coming too, she said with the tone of someone clarifying a point that should not have been in question. I want to learn the mountain. Harlan looked at her, something in his face opened by a degree. I can teach you the mountain, he said. I know every trail on it. I know, Wren said and went back to her drawing. The 30-day notice from the Federal Land Office had not resolved itself in the absence of attention, as Declan had known it would not. He had made 3 phone calls in the 2 days since coming down from the mountain, using the focused, methodical persistence that had served him through 15 years in situations that required both. He had called the ranger station in Linville. He had called the regional land office in Asheville and spoken to 2 people, one of whom was helpful and one of whom was not. He had called a property rights attorney in Morganton named Gerald Fitch, who answered his own phone, asked good questions without interrupting, charged reasonable rates, and said after 22 minutes, "This is winnable. It requires noise. Are you comfortable making noise?" Declan said he was comfortable with that. The noise, it turned out, had already begun without him. A woman named Patricia Odom, who ran the Historical Society in Linville and had apparently known of Harlan Briggs's rescue work for decades without having the opportunity to act on that knowledge, had heard through whatever channel small mountain communities use to transmit important information, which has no formal name and requires no infrastructure, that Harlan was being pushed off his land. She had called the ranger station. She had called the county commissioner's office. She had called the local paper, which ran the story on a Thursday under the headline, "Former Mountain Rescue Leader Faces Eviction After Decades of Service." It was not a long story. It did not need to be. By Friday afternoon, Declan's phone had taken calls from 4 people who had been pulled off the Blue Ridge by Harlan's team. Douglas Reeves, who had broken both legs on the Tanoa Trail in 2008, and whose hands showed the frostbite that three of his fingers had not fully recovered from who had driven up from Hickory when he read the story. Beverly Marsh, a retired school teacher whose husband had been found in a creek bed in 2012, hypothermic and incoherent but alive, who wept quietly during the call and asked what she could do and meant it. And Caleb Pruitt, 31, now broad-shouldered, a father himself, who had been 14 years old and once on the mountain for 2 nights in 2014, and whose name appeared in Harlan's field log with the notation subject located above East Ridge. Ranger on track. Condition cold, frightened, unharmed. Each of them said some version of the same thing. What do you need? Tell me how to help. Declan wrote their names in a notebook and thought about the letter in his jacket pocket and thought about a woman who had spent 5 years tracking down a stranger to complete an act of gratitude because she believed that things deserved to be finished. He thought this is finishable. The hearing before the Regional Federal Land Use Committee took place on a Tuesday morning in a county building in Morganton that smelled of old carpet and institutional coffee, the specific combination of scents that belongs to places where bureaucratic decisions with real consequences are made by people who take both the bureaucracy and the consequences seriously. The room had 30 chairs, and all of them were filled. People stood along the back wall and into the hallway, which meant the sound inside was the particular sound of a room that has more people in it than it was designed for, a quality of contained energy that the institutional fluorescent lighting did nothing to diminish. Harlan had not wanted to come. He had stood in Declan's kitchen that morning in the best shirt from the bag Declan had retrieved from the cabin. Dark blue clean, pressed by Declan with an iron he had found in the closet and used for the first time since moving to the Blue Ridge, and said that he had never been comfortable with rooms full of people directing their attention at him, and he saw no reason why this particular room full of people should be different. Declan had said, "They're not looking at you. They're here for you. Those are different things." Harlan had looked at him for a moment and then put on his jacket. He had come. He sat at the front table beside Gerald Fitch, who had the organized, deliberate bearing of a man who has prepared thoroughly and trusts his preparation. Rex sat at Harlan's feet. The committee had not specifically authorized the dog's presence and had not specifically objected to it. And in that gap, Rex had established himself with the same quiet certainty he brought to most situations. Declan sat in the second row with Wren beside him and watched the room fill and thought about the nature of debts, how some are financial and some are moral, and some are the kind that live in the body that a person carries in their bones for years and feels most clearly on cold mornings and during storms, and how those kinds of debts have a way of presenting themselves for settlement when the time is right. Gerald Fitch presented the legal argument, first adverse possession, decade-plus residency. No active federal development plan for the parcel, the eviction notice filed under a commercial provision being applied to a residential situation for which it was not intended. The argument was solid, and he made it cleanly without embellishment, letting the facts carry the weight they were capable of carrying. Then the room spoke. Douglas Reeves went first. He walked to the small podium with the careful gait of someone who has relearned walking from a position of having needed to relearn it, each step deliberate, none taken for granted. He told the committee about the night in 2008 when Harlan Briggs's team had carried him off the mountain on a litter in the dark in dropping temperatures across terrain that Douglas now understood, having looked at maps of it again recently, should probably have been impassable. He didn't have to come, Douglas said. The weather was turning and it was after official hours, and he came anyway because that was what he did. That was who he was. He looked at the committee. I've been asking myself what we owe a man like that for 15 years. I'd like to think the answer includes not throwing him off the mountain he spent his life protecting. Beverly Marsh spoke about her husband, who sat beside her in the second row and who took her hand when she described the creek bed, the cold, the voice coming through the dark, telling him help was coming and meaning it. Caleb Pruitt stood at the podium and looked young and nervous and entirely certain. I was 14, he said. I was alone up there for 2 nights. I'd stopped believing anyone was coming. He paused. He looked at Rex, who was watching him from the front of the room with steady amber eyes. The dog found me, and then the team was there. He stopped. I have a daughter now. She's 4 years old. She is the reason I do everything. She wouldn't exist if Harlan Briggs and his team hadn't come up that mountain. He stepped back from the podium and sat down without looking at anyone, because he had said the thing he'd come to say, and there wasn't a better way to say it. The deputy coordinator who had filed the eviction notice was a man named Aaron Slade Young. Precise, clearly someone who had been hired for his organizational competence and his adherence to procedure, which were real qualities and not blameworthy in themselves. He sat at the side table with a folder of documents he had stopped consulting sometime during Douglas Reeves' testimony. He had the expression of someone conducting an internal recalculation that had been running since the room started filling up. When the committee chair invited final statements, Aaron Slade stood up. He didn't look at his folder. I filed the eviction notice, he said, because the procedure called for it, and I followed the procedure because following procedure is what I do and I'm good at it. He paused. His jaw tightened once. What I didn't do was find out who Harlan Briggs was before I filed it. I knew the parcel number and the regulation and the timeline. I didn't know the man. Another pause, and when he continued, the official quality had gone out of his voice, and what remained was just a man's voice in a room full of people. My father had a cardiac event on the Grandfather Mountain Connector Trail in 2003. He was alone. He went off trail and had the event and was unable to call for help. He stopped. He looked at Harlan directly, not at the committee. Harlan Briggs's team reached him in 40 minutes. The paramedic told my mother afterward that another 20 minutes would have been. He didn't finish. He didn't need to. My father is 71 years old. He's at home right now. He'll meet his grandchildren this weekend. He looked at Harlan for another moment. I'm withdrawing the eviction notice. I'm recommending the parcel be designated Heritage Residential with protected status for the lifetime of the primary resident. He sat down. The room was quiet for a moment. Then it was not quiet. Harlan sat at the front table and did not turn around to look at the room. He looked at his hands on the table, the hands of a man who has spent decades doing physical work in difficult conditions, the hands of someone who has carried things literally that most people never have to carry. Then he looked at Rex, who had stood up and was leaning his full weight against Harlan's leg with the steady, warm pressure of a dog that understands its function in a moment and is executing it. Declan watched Harlan's shoulders and saw them change. Not drop Harlan. Briggs did not have the kind of posture that dropped, but release. The specific release of a structure that has been bracing against a load that has now been removed, 74 years of uprightness maintained through loss and solitude, and the long patient work of waiting for an ending, and now something had arrived from the other direction with enough force to change the geometry of the whole situation. Harlan put his hand on Rex's head. Wren beside Declan slipped her hand into his without looking at him or making anything of it. He closed his fingers around her hand and held on. The procedure went well. Dr. Pruitt called it textbook, which was as Declan had come to understand the most precise and valuable word in her clinical vocabulary deployed sparingly for situations that had earned it. Harlan spent one night in the hospital, one night of monitoring of a bed that moved electronically of nurses who checked in at regular intervals with the professional cheerfulness of people who have decided that warmth is a clinical tool and are right, and was discharged the following afternoon with a typed list of instructions that he read carefully on the drive home, annotating it in his precise handwriting in the margins. He was thinner than he should have been. He moved with more deliberateness than before. His color was better than it had been in the cabin. He sat in the truck and looked out the window at the mountains and was quiet, but it was a different quality of quiet than the one he'd brought down from the mountain, less like waiting and more like considering. The difference between a man who has stopped moving and a man who is deciding where to go next. Wren in the back with Rex told him about everything that had happened in his absence. The chickens. A book about mountain ecosystems she was reading. A dream she'd had about her mother in the kitchen, the light coming through the window the way it does in the morning, her mother laughing at something, and the dream feeling, Wren said, like a normal morning. Not sad, just morning. Harlan listened to all of it. He asked the names of the chickens, which he had learned at the dinner table, and was confirming he had retained correctly. He asked about the book. He was quiet for a moment about the dream, and then said, "That's a good kind." "I know," Wren said. "I think she checks in sometimes, to make sure things are okay." Harlan nodded with the gravity of someone treating a serious statement seriously. "I think that's probably right," he said. "Spring came to the Blue Ridge in the way it always came, not arriving but accumulating. First a change in the quality of the light, something warmer in the angle of it. Then snowdrops along the south-facing slopes, white and improbable in the remaining cold. Then the smell of mud and moving water as the frozen creek beside the cabin found its voice again after the long silence of winter. Then the slow return of green to the ridgelines week by week, each one adding another layer, until the mountains looked like something painted by someone with a specific and passionate investment in the subject." Harlan went back to his cabin in April when the trail was passable and the nights had climbed above freezing. He went with an emergency satellite communicator clipped to his jacket, a small orange device that could send a location ping and receive acknowledgement, and had a dedicated SOS function that Declan had made him practice using before he left. He went with a wood pile that Declan and Wren had spent 2 Saturdays rebuilding to a height that would carry through the following winter, Wren stacking with the focus of a child who has been given a job and takes it seriously. He went with a standing arrangement. Declan and Wren would come up on weekends, alternating between the trail and the drive to the trailhead, depending on conditions, in Harlan's assessment of the weather. Rex went with them when they came and stayed 3 days and came back down with Declan and Wren, as if this division of his time between two households were a schedule he had established himself through careful deliberation and found perfectly satisfactory, as if both places were his to belong to, and he had simply arranged things accordingly. The property designation came through in March before Harlan went back up heritage residential protected status, not subject to federal land use reallocation for the lifetime of the primary resident. Gerald Fitch called to deliver the news with the understated satisfaction of a man who does not celebrate prematurely but sees no reason to pretend he is not pleased with a good outcome. He said he would send the formal documentation and that Harlan should keep it somewhere accessible. Declan had told Harlan by phone that evening they had established a system, the satellite communicator, making a voice call possible from the cabin each evening at 7, so that Declan knew the old man was upright and Harlan knew the child was fed and Rex knew where everyone was. Harlan said, "Good." A pause. "Thank you, Declan. You thanked me already. I'm thanking you again. It's different this time." "How is it different?" Another pause. "The first time I was thanking you for the legal work," Harlan said. "This time I'm thanking you for the rest of it." Declan didn't answer that. He didn't need to. The Navy called on a Friday afternoon in May. Declan was in the yard splitting wood, a practice he had taken up in the fall as something to do with his hands, and continued because it turned out that splitting wood required exactly enough attention to occupy the mind's operational capacity without consuming the deeper levels, which left those deeper levels free to work through things at their own pace. He had found this useful in the same way he had found other physical disciplines useful over the years, not as distraction, but as calibration. He set the maul down when he saw the number and stood in the yard with the smell of cut wood around him and the mountains going green in the late afternoon light, and listened to the colonel explain the offer. A training position stateside, developing curriculum for K-9 integration and special operations units, work at the intersection of the two things Declan knew better than almost anything else. The salary was appropriate. The work would matter. The colonel gave him 2 weeks and said he understood it was a significant decision. Declan thanked him and said he would think about it. He stood in the yard after the call for a long time. Rex came from the barn and sat beside him. Not in front, not seeking attention, but beside in the position he took when he was reading something in Declan's posture that indicated his presence was useful without being intrusive. Declan looked at the wood pile. He looked at the barn from which he could hear the small, constant commentary of Wren's chickens. He looked at the porch where he had stood every morning for 2 winters with cold coffee and no direction. He looked at the mountains green now entirely themselves, present in the way that permanent things are present, not demanding attention but simply there as background and context and frame. He thought about the letter in the bedside table drawer, where it had moved from his jacket pocket close enough to reach in the dark if he needed it. Take care of Wren, not perfectly, just present, just there. He thought about what it meant to be needed in the ordinary way, not the operational way, the high-stakes way, that consumed you completely, and in consuming you made you feel essential in a way that was real but not sustainable, and left a particular kind of hollow when it ended. The ordinary way, the way a foundation is needed, the way a consistent presence is needed, the way a child needs to know that the person who is there in the morning will be there in the evening without performance or explanation, simply as the established fact of the situation. He thought about the Ranger Foundation, the name he and Harlan had said aloud several times over the past months, each time with more specificity, each time feeling more like a structure and less like a conversation. He had spoken to a veterans advocacy organization in Asheville. He had spoken to a therapist in Boone who specialized in veterans and had said when Declan described what he was thinking, that the combination of mountain terrain and working dogs in a therapeutic context was one of the most evidence-supported frameworks she knew of, and she would be glad to consult. He went inside and called the colonel back. He thanked him for the offer sincerely because it was a real opportunity offered by someone who had been thoughtful about making it, and he said no. He sat at the kitchen table afterward and felt the decision settle into him with the particular quality of a choice made in the right direction. Not relief exactly, though. Some of that was present, but clarity. The specific clarity of a decision that knows what it is and doesn't require further examination. Wren came in from outside with mud on her boots and a chicken feather caught in her hair that she was entirely unaware of. She looked at him sitting at the table and said, "What?" "I made a decision," he said. "What kind?" "The kind about what comes next." She assessed him for a moment with her mother's eyes. "Good or bad?" "Good," he said. "I think definitely good." She nodded satisfied and went to the sink. "Harlan called," she said over her shoulder. "He said to tell you the snowdrops are coming up around the cabin and you should bring your camera Saturday." She paused. "He also said to bring more coffee because the tin he has left is almost empty and he doesn't trust what's left of it." "He's getting particular about his coffee," Declan said. "He's getting particular about everything," Wren said, drying her hands. "I think that's a good sign. People who don't care about anything aren't particular about anything." She looked at him with the specific certainty of an 8-year-old who has worked something out and is confident in the working. "When you start caring about the coffee again, you're coming back." Declan looked at his daughter for a moment. "Yeah," he said, "I think that's right." The Ranger Foundation held its first retreat weekend in September when the Blue Ridge had gone from summer green to the early fire of autumn, the maples beginning their turn, while the oaks still held their color, the mountains in the complicated beauty of a season that knows it is ending and has decided to make something of it. 6 veterans came for the first weekend. They came from Charlotte, from Raleigh, from a small town outside Fayetteville. They came with different branches and different deployments in different specific shapes of damage, but with the same fundamental quality, the quality of people who have returned from somewhere and are still in the process of figuring out what returning means, what it asks of them, what it permits. 3 dogs came also, Rex among them, the oldest by several years with his silver muzzle and his scarred ear, and the unhurried authority of a dog that has been doing this work in various forms for 11 years and knows what it is for. Harlan ran the mountain. He walked the trails each morning with the veterans slower than he once had, with a care that had not been part of his movement before the winter, but with the absolute authority of a man who has belonged to a place for a long time and knows it in a way that goes past information into something more like fluency. He knew where the trail deteriorated and where it opened. He knew which ridge gave the best view of the valley in the morning light and which creek crossing was reliable and which one required attention after rain. He knew the mountain the way you know a language you have spoken for 50 years without translation directly as the thing itself. Declan ran the logistics, the schedule, the meals, the coordination with the therapist from Boone who came for 2 days and spoke to the veterans individually and in the group with the same unhurried directness he had found useful in Dr. Pruitt, the directness of someone who has been telling difficult truths for a long time and has found the language that works. Rex moved between everyone. He appeared at the right moment with the consistency of something that has decided this is its work and intends to do it well. He spent time with each veteran, sometimes pressing against a leg, sometimes simply lying nearby with his chin on his paws, making himself available without demanding engagement. He seemed to know with the accuracy that working dogs sometimes have, and that no one has satisfactorily explained which person needed him most at any given moment. On the last evening, they sat on the ridge above Harlan's cabin and watched the sun go down over the valley. 6 veterans and 1 old man and 1 8-year-old girl who had come up Saturday morning and whom nobody had been willing to tell she couldn't be there, and 1 German shepherd who moved between them all with his quiet certainty. Wren sat beside Harlan and asked him to name the peaks she could see from where they were sitting. He named them all. Everyone without hesitation with the specific details she wanted, which ones had trails, which ones were accessible in winter, which ones held the snow longest in spring, which one his team had worked most frequently over the years. He named them the way you name things you know by heart, not by consulting a memory, but by returning to it the way you return to a place you have always known. One of the veterans, a man named Strother, who had come from outside Raleigh and had said approximately 40 words over the 4 days of the weekend, which was either less than he usually said or more, and it was impossible to tell which looked out at the valley going gold in the failing light, and said mostly to himself quietly, "I forgot it looked like this." Nobody asked him to explain. It didn't need explanation. It was understood by everyone sitting on that ridge what was being said, and what was being said was true, and the truth of it required exactly as much response as it received, which was none. Rex moved to Strother and leaned against his leg. The man's hand went to the dog's back without any apparent decision being made. The automatic reach of a person who has encountered something trustworthy and responds to it before the thinking mind has had time to weigh in. His hand rested there on Rex's back, and Rex held still under it, and the valley went from gold to copper to the deep blue of early evening, and nobody moved or spoke for a long time. Declan watched all of it and said nothing, and let the evening be what it was. Later, after the veterans had gone back to the cabin for dinner, after Wren had fallen asleep in the chair, by Harlan's wood stove, in the complete instantaneous way of children who resist sleep until the body simply makes the decision unilaterally, Declan and Harlan sat on the porch in the September dark. The mountains were shapes against a sky enormous with stars. The kind of sky that the Blue Ridge produces on clear autumn nights, when the air is dry and the light pollution is a distant memory, a sky that makes the scale of things apparent, that makes you feel simultaneously small and strangely belonging, as if the smallness is not a diminishment, but a clarification of where you fit in the arrangement of things. Rex was on the porch between them asleep. His breathing was steady. His paws moved occasionally in whatever the dream was. His silver muzzle rested on his front legs. "She would have liked this," Harlan said. He meant Nora. They had reached the point where they could speak of her without preface or setup, as if she were a mutual friend who had stepped away from the table and might return at any moment, and in the meantime her name required no ceremony to use. "She would have been running it," Declan said. "Better than us, more efficiently." "Probably." Harlan was quiet for a moment. "I've been thinking about something," she wrote. "What you've told me of it." He paused the way he paused when he was saying something he had been thinking about for a long time and was saying for the first time. About things finding us when we need them. "Yeah. I've been thinking," Harlan said carefully, "that the dog didn't find her. And he didn't find you. He found all of us. At different times in different weather when we each needed finding. But the direction was the same all along." He looked at Rex sleeping between them. "Some things know the full shape of what they're doing, even when we can only see our own piece of it." Declan looked at the stars for a while. "She wrote that I should trust whatever was leading somewhere," he said. "Whatever was guiding." Smart woman. The smartest. Rex shifted in his sleep. Made that sound, not a whine, not quite a bark, but the older thing, the sound that had no good name in human language, the sound that had seemed in the silence of the mountain cabin on the first night like a door opening. Declan looked at the mountains. He thought about the man who had stood on a porch with cold coffee 2 winters ago, and no direction and nothing that felt like it was pointing anywhere useful. He thought about following a dog into trees on a gray morning because the time was certain, and certainty was in short supply, and it seemed worth following. He thought about a man on the floor of a cabin, a drawer open an inch, a letter that had been waiting, a child's drawing of a dog, a room full of people carrying a debt they had been waiting to put down. He thought about how none of it had looked like what it was from the inside of it, how each piece had seemed separate and unconnected until enough of them were present that the pattern became visible, and then it had always been the pattern, and the separation had been an illusion of position. "I'm glad Rex took that trail," he said. Harlan made a sound of agreement. "He always knew the way," he said. "I just didn't know where he was going." A quiet settled over them that was not the silence of absence, but the silence of completion, the specific quiet that arrives when things have been said that needed saying, and the people who needed to say them have said them, and now the night can simply be the night. Rex slept on. Declan looked at the stars a while longer. Then he looked at Rex at the silver muzzle, the scarred ear, the steady breathing of a dog that had crossed 9 years in a mountain in a military training program in a grief-filled household, and had arrived at 11 years old at a porch in the Blue Ridge Mountains between two men who had needed finding and felt something settle in him that had not been settled for a long time. Not healed, not finished, but settled. The way you settle into a house when it has finally become a home, not because anything dramatic has happened, but because enough time has passed in it and enough things have been lived in it, and it has come to hold the shape of the life you are actually living rather than the life you thought you would be living, and you have come to understand that these are not so different as you feared. In the morning, he would call Lily from the Veterans Network about the next weekend cohort. He would call the Boone therapist about expanding the program. He would drive to the hardware store for lumber because there was a fence section that needed repair before winter. He would make breakfast for Wren, who would come into the kitchen with her hair sideways and tell him something specific and important about one of the chickens. He would call Harlan at 7 in the evening and hear the old man's voice steadier each week is the voice of someone with a reason to keep it steady. These were the things that waited. Ordinary, continuous, weight-bearing. He looked at the valley below, barely visible now in the dark, a shape implied by the lights in it, scattered warm human lights, the evidence of people in houses doing the ordinary things that people in houses do, the accumulated ordinary. That was he had come to understand the point, not the dramatic moments, the accumulated ordinary. "I should get Wren to bed," he said. "She's fine where she is," Harlan said. "She'll sleep better in the chair than she would in a car." "You're probably right. I'm frequently right about things involving sleep. I've had a lot of experience being wrong about it." Declan almost smiled. "Good night, Harlan." "Good night, Declan." Rex lifted his head briefly at the sound of his name, not being said the way dogs do, responsive to the texture of a conversation, rather than the specific words, and then put it back down and returned to his dream. The stars moved in their slow arc over the Blue Ridge, the same stars that had been over these mountains for longer than the mountains themselves, indifferent and present and there. And somewhere down in the valley, in a room Declan was thinking about Nora's letter, was in the bedside drawer folded carefully, the words he had read in the snow on a porch on a mountain available to him whenever he needed them. Not going anywhere. Not thinning. There. I love you. I love you. I'm sorry I didn't say it enough. I'll find a way to keep saying it. She had found a way. It had taken a boy in a mountain and a dying man in a cabin and an afternoon's worth of conversation in the spring of 2021 and 3 years of waiting in a drawer and an 11-year-old German shepherd who had decided on a cold gray morning that it was time to take a different trail. But she had found a way. Some dogs don't just find the lost. They find the ones who forgot they were worth finding, and the ones who forgot there was something left worth building, and the ones who had stopped, believing that the distance between where they were and where they needed to be was crossable, and they lead them back, one careful step at a time, across whatever terrain is required, in whatever weather comes.